Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we will cover the first round of the Romanian presidential election, where the hard-right candidate George Simion soared to a first-place finish. Then we will discuss British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's attempt to reset relations with the European Union ahead of a May 19th Brexit summit. Then we'll turn to a conversation with Abe Newman, professor in the School of Foreign Service and Government Departments at Georgetown University and director of the BMW Center for German and European Studies, about the coming transatlantic tech collisions. We hope you enjoy the show. Okay, Donatien, what happened in Romania? This election had been in some ways a long time coming, as the previous first round of the election had been annulled by the Romanian court due to alleged Russian social media interference that was very controversial at the time, led to a lot of criticism by members of the Trump administration or incoming Trump administration. So what were the results here and what does it mean?
So the first round that we just saw in Romania saw George Simion, as you mentioned, who's a hard-right leader of the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, come in first with a lot more votes than what the polls were projecting, although we should caveat that polls in Romania have historically not always been that reliable. But in any case, he came in with just under 41% of the vote in the first round, and the polls had him around 30%. So it's quite a gap. That means he is going to the second round. If he had gone over 50%, he would have won this time around and become the president of Romania. Simion is a supporter of President Trump. He has said he wants to stop military aid to Ukraine. He is not particularly pro-European Union, which at this particular time is a little bit scary, I think, for Brussels. So once again, we're seeing stories out of Europe where potentially we're seeing another government turn a little bit far right. Now, the president doesn't have as much power as the prime minister, but still, it's an important position in Romania. The second, or I should say the runner-up here, second place, who will go to the second round, is the mayor of Bucharest. His name is Nicu Sordan. He is a little bit more establishment. He's an independent candidate, though. He's not affiliated with any particular party. He's in this trend that we've seen in Eastern Europe, especially in Romania and Bulgaria, of people who were doing intellectual jobs on the outside of politics who decided to go in because they felt like their country needed a little more push towards or away from corruption and all these issues. He was a mathematician before becoming mayor in 2020. So this is the person who came in second. He, I would say, represents the pro-European Union, pro-NATO, pro-West, you could say, candidate in this two-person runoff, because the next round is only two people. It's a pretty big blow for the actual establishment candidate, which represents the Grand Coalition that is currently governing Romania. That candidate, Crin Antonescu, just didn't make it. Not by a lot, but
I think it was
lost
close.
anyway.
It was like 1 point separated.
Exactly. But he didn't make it. That's a sign, once again, that I think Romanian voters are just really tired. First of all, they just went to the polls at the end of 2024. They're being asked to do it again. And Romania has a history also of coalition governments and prime ministers falling left and right and having to have a technical government in place. And I just think this is another sign that people are a little bit tired of hearing all the time, just one more time, elect us one more time, we'll make a change. And the change does not come.
Yeah, I think, Simion, he doesn't like to call himself far right, but he's a big supporter of President Trump and the MAGA movement. I think he's prone to wear MAGA hats. He's very anti-Ukraine and wants to cut off aid to Ukraine. He's therefore banned from visiting Ukraine as well as potentially Moldova, which is sort of awkward. And in some ways, he's a political neophyte. So there's, I think, a lot of just uncertainty about what this would mean. He's clearly in pole position to potentially win the presidential runoff. And what we've seen is that sort of unity candidates of the center left, center right parties sometimes tend to struggle to sort of pull together a very cohesive coalition while you have someone that clearly represents kind of dramatic change. On the other hand, it does seem like with the Bucharest mayor, Dan, that they have the slightly more insurgent of the mainstream candidates, someone who is not aligned with any of the major parties, was an independent, and therefore maybe can sort of pull everyone together and sort of represents an alternative. And you have a situation perhaps like in France where even though Macron was sort of not deeply liked going into his second election and into the second round, still ended up winning that election somewhat handily. Now, I think this looks like it's going to be very close. We'll have to see what happens the next few days. I do think that this will lead to lots of talk about, is Europe screwed? Oh my God, if this guy wins and he's far right, and then you have Orban, and then the sky is falling. The sky has been falling in Europe for the last decade. And every single election of a far right party, whether they do well in Sweden or another place, it represents the sort of end of the line. I think what this does is potentially complicate things in Europe because it gives Orban perhaps an ally. Although the Hungarians and the Romanians, tend to, not get on. There are a bunch of Hungarians, ethnic Hungarians in Transylvania on the other side, stranded in Romania, as the Hungarians would say, air quotes were there. So can the far right unite? I don't know. But what I do know is the EU has lots of tools to manage this potential problem. They have lots of leverage. And I think one of the major frustrations that people like Dan Kellerman, non-resident with us, have is that the EU doesn't oftentimes use its tools to really confront Hungary and other countries that sort of undermine the rule of law. What the EU does do is it just manages the problem. It's like, okay, if you want to have this fight, we can tool up and fight, or we can just sort of pay you off and let this problem go away. And then what the EU has done with Hungary is just continually kick the can down the road. Now, the thing about kicking the can down the road is that eventually there could be this major collision or not. Right? Hungary's going to have elections. Maybe that will be the collision, or maybe Orban will lose that election and it will be a legitimate process and we'll have a new Hungarian leader, and the kicking the can strategy may have been proven effective. So I think the notions that the sky is falling in Europe, which happen all the time, and that is what gets covered in New York Times and other places, I think we should be a little cautious about going there.
Yeah, I think we should be cautious. It's also Simeon wouldn't have that much power if he were to make it as president. It's not a good thing, though. Obviously, I mean, Klaus Johannes, who was the president before, was a very strong, even pro-NATO voice, which is important.
Talked about as a potential sec-gen of
exactly,
NATO.
Especially given Romania's location these days in particular. It's important for there not to be even more instability in Romania, but we also shouldn't fool ourselves that prior to this, it was a remarkably politically stable country. No shade in that. It's just from the last 15 years, it has not been a politically stable country. So this election is not the thing that's going to tip all of us over the edge, but it's not necessarily a good sign. That's
the Romanians are quite lucky that in 2005, 6, and 7, that the EU said, okay, fine, you can come in, and they didn't get stuck in the waiting room like the Western Balkans countries.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that the way this will play out in American politics is particularly the White House and others will sort of grab this to say, look, the far right is ascendant. And we've also seen this week a really intense back and forth in some ways between Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, and the German Foreign Office over, I think it's the German Interior Ministry's decision to effectively label the AfD potentially an extremist group that is therefore a potential threat to German democracy. And I think that, first provision of the German constitution is effectively like, we're never doing that again. And to take into account, extremist groups and to not go down that route. And that constitution is one that the United States helped them draft. And the back and forth was essentially a strong attack from Rubio and Vance on what is a German governmental decision. Then the German Foreign Office responding, saying, we're a democracy and this is what we do, like back off. I do wonder, the German Foreign Ministry's Twitter account has been known to sort of, throw some punches here and there. Right now, you have an outgoing Green government. We're recording on Monday, May 5th. Tomorrow, Friedrich Merz will become German Chancellor. Is this sort of the outgoing Green government being like throwing a punch? And will you get a slightly more toned down German Foreign Ministry Twitter account starting tomorrow that then doesn't want to provoke a fight with the United States and just sort of lets the water slide off? I don't know. I don't think their response was problematic, but I think what it demonstrates in general is where we are in transatlantic relations is that there's a bit of an illusion that you can just engage with the White House on a transactional basis and that this is just a transactional administration that just wants to do deals and doesn't care about ideology. I think what's pretty clear is they do not care about small L liberalism and promoting democracy. They do have an ideological agenda, which is, I think, of the illiberal variety, illiberal policies and leaders, and so backing Viktor Orban and others. And I don't think they would really object to me characterizing that way. And so you see them call out Germany, but then when, the Turkish President Erdogan goes and arrests his main political rival And there's crickets from the State Department. And basically the State Department's like, oh, we don't comment on internal decisions that are made. But yet we do when it's something that we politically don't agree with. So I think all this adds into what I think will be very intense US-German relationship, and a sense that there's an ideological parting of the ways, that the Europeans are small L liberals, while America's going in a more illiberal Orbanist direction. And that may divide Europe, but I think for many of the European liberals is only going to add to the sense that a divorce is coming in transatlantic relations.
There's definitely ideological connections, at least with a faction of this administration. And they're not new. We've seen this for years, even before the November 5th election here in the US. There have been a lot more connections between all of these groups on both sides of the Atlantic, from, CPAC organizing itself in Budapest a couple times to other more theorists of the movement really coming together, people like Steve Bannon also. So that's definitely an element that is not negligible and was not really present in the first Trump administration, but is more visible now with some people.
There were some efforts in the first Trump administration, but it didn't really.
It was nascent, and now they've had a lot more time. Yeah. Those connections have stayed when Joe Biden was president.
Also,
they
these
kept
parties
growing.
Have become a bit more established. But I think maybe let's turn to our final topic, which is another divorce that happened, and now the
very
talks,
protracted
divorce, very messy, very ugly between the UK and EU, and now they're talking again. What's happening now in UK-EU relations?
Well, the thing we all thought was basically done and forgotten turns out is not quite done, which is Brexit.
Never dies.
What is dead may never die, for those who know the reference. Basically, there's going to be a summit. There's a Brexit summit between London and Brussels on May 19th. There's some issues that still need to be hammered out around cross-border trade on electricity, for example, fishing in English waters, etc. All these things were
English
never
waters or French waters.
Well, sure. Depends who you ask. But also boats, funny enough, move around between both. And fish do too. So
that's the problem.
There's going to be a summit where they are trying to address this. They also want to address the security and defense cooperation piece, which is very important right now. As I'm sure you've all heard, there's a war going on the continent. And there's a set of incentives on both sides. For Brussels, there are things they care about, in particular, fishing for sure. I'm sure to some listeners, it might seem like a really small issue, but it's a visceral issue across different member states and in the UK as well. We all remember Boris Johnson waving around that fish. So it seems small, but it's not small for many of these leaders.
It's small, but okay, continue.
Do you know what I mean?
I'm just going to mentally mock it.
Politically not small. So there's going to be demands on the European side to get this agreement on fishing extended beyond 2026, which is when it runs out. There's also been an idea on the table for a while around youth exchanges, which honestly is one of the biggest accomplishments of the EU over the last few decades, is the Erasmus program, for example, is students going to study in other parts of Europe, which is really what creates the sense of being European and would create some really healthy ties between the UK and the rest of the continent. They want to find ways to do this. On the UK side, obviously, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, wants to find a way for the UK to have access to this nascent EU fund for defense, because it's not nothing. And obviously, they want a piece of that, but also good collaboration on defense, because aside from Brexit, we're also all still in a defense alliance together. And then the problem for Starmer is that he's facing political pressures at home. Last week, we had local council elections in parts of England that were not particularly good for Labour. They were terrible for the Conservatives, but they were excellent for Nigel Farage's party, Reform UK. Nigel Farage, obviously of Brexit fame, who led the charge to leave the European Union and has remained around politics in the UK for quite a while. And he won pretty important places, bigger cities than usual for mayors as well, and then won MP. So Keir Starmer is feeling the heat, and one of the things he's feeling the heat on from Farage's party is migration. That's kind of where the rubber meets the road for the EU to be able to send all these young people in exchanges. It counts towards the statistics for the UK, and then the political wheel starts turning, and everyone says, well, it looks like we're getting a ton of people, but actually they're Europeans. But let's be honest, that's not necessarily the immigrants that parts of the UK is worried about. So There's a lot of incentives on both sides. The negotiations pre-summit are still going. They seem to be pretty painful. But I think there's willingness on both sides to find an agreement because at some point, you kind of have to get it done.
Yeah, I think, look, for Starmer, the Labour Party was the party that largely voted Remain, but not fully. And he has been trying to sort of turn the page on Brexit. But as we noted, you can't really turn the page on Brexit. And so what he is needing is to figure out how to improve ties with the EU. And the EU then also has this decision to make about whether and how to improve ties with the UK. Because part of the challenge here is actually the EU being in some ways fairly unreasonable, shocker, because we have a situation where the EU, quite rightly, is like, we don't want an a la carte Europe, where the UK can then pick and choose the things they like about being a member of the EU or being connected to the EU, but then not choose other things. And then, maybe the Danes decide, what, that's not actually the worst outcome. That's something we want to sign up for. And so they've been very focused on having this degree of deterrent. You leave, you get screwed. And they have really proved their point, I think, over the last, whenever it happened, last 9 years ago.
40 years ago.
But it's been officially in place now for a number of years. But I do think the UK does have some cards here, and that's on defense. And what we saw back in the 1990s, that when the UK decided that it wasn't going to sign up for the euro and the common currency, Tony Blair needed to show that he was pro-European, and the issue that he picked that he thought was in some ways going to be the least controversial was EU defense. And that was the same Malo declaration between Chirac and Blair, and then the US killed it, as I've talked about. But defense has been an area where, okay, that makes sense. It makes sense for both sides. If the EU has real money in defense, it actually really wants to have the UK involved because the UK is instrumental to the European defense industrial base. There's a lot of defense industrial cooperation between the UK and France, companies like MBDA that produce missiles and other things. There's just a lot of defense and integration. So if the EU is going to be spending a lot of money, it naturally, some of that's going to go to the UK. It would actually be hard to disentangle that. And it's not in the interest of either party. The EU also wants to have the UK as, if the US is leaving or gone militarily, to be there. So it makes a lot of sense on defense and security. Okay, so that is something that is in the interest of both parties. Then you get to some of the people to people. And I think this makes sense for both sides, especially for young voters in the UK. I think ultimately what the UK and EU should want is a degree of connectivity with that next generation. You don't want to have the break. You want to have Brits studying in Europe and Europeans studying in the UK the way it's been. So you at least have that cultural connection that's there. And then who knows, maybe in 10, 15 years, this is my view of what's going to happen, there'll be some center-right Tory party that's like, why don't we just rejoin this thing? Which is, of course, what happened in the first place. The other aspect here, which I think is the thing to watch, is that the UK is stuck economically. It's just totally stuck. It really shot itself in both feet with Brexit. It's really hurt its economic competitiveness. This whole global Britain thing was sort of nonsense. It hasn't really been able to strike the trade deals that it was hoping for. And now you have a situation where the EU's like going around saying, you get a free trade deal, India, you get a free trade deal, Mercosur, UAE, CPTPP, of which the UK is part of. And so you could have a situation where the EU's really going forward on the free trade area. And the question is, does Starmer take a bigger step than what we think? Does he take a bigger step than what is expected and really move the UK back towards the EU, looking at the US as sort of like, this isn't really ever going to happen. We're never really going to have a free trade agreement. We're always going to now have 10% tariffs or whatever they're going to be, 15%. And I can do a deal with the EU. And does he accept a loss of political control that would be more akin to Norway or Switzerland? I think that's sort of one of the big questions really at play. Like, how far is he willing to go economically to try to boost UK competitiveness at a time when politically he's on the rocks? There's no real plan for how to energize this economy. And that looks to me as a potential pathway. I don't know if he's going to do it, but there's been some murmurs that that's something that they're looking closely at, not to reinvigorate Brexit, but in some ways to reverse some of the economic damage that it's caused.
That would also help them really close, not the full book, but the chapter on whatever's been happening with Brexit since the Trade and Cooperation Agreement of 2021, which left some things unresolved. And that would make it more clean. It would also, it's important for us to say, make things cleaner for Northern Ireland as well, which has continued to be a difficult point around the trade and what comes to Northern Ireland, but not onto the rest of Great Britain, et cetera, et cetera. So it would definitely make things easier. Now, the elections I just talked about earlier, they're local, they're council, mayoral. There was just one exceptional parliament election for one district. But the other ones, the big ones, are not for another 4 years.
Yeah.
So he has time there, but he's a naturally cautious person. So that will be
This was
balance.
A big warning shot across Labor's bow.
Sure.
But
conservatives suffered more.
Yeah, but I think for both parties, I don't know where the conservatives go because, I mean, this is where do they go in a more pro-EU direction? Because the Conservative Party is now fractured. For Labor, there's clear unhappiness. And just spinning your wheels and hoping the economy gets better, I think is not a great plan. And so this is where you have 4 years to try. Now's the time to try a new direction. And we'll see. We'll see what happens. I think it's a clear warning sign that UK politics is going to be rather fractious. And the idea of sort of a two-party system between Labour and Conservatives looks like probably a future government, if the results sort of stand, is likely going to have to be a multi-party coalition. And even on the center, left, and left side of the spectrum with the Green Party, the Lib Dems being there. So lots of exciting things to watch out for in the coming weeks with the UK-EU summit. Also with Friedrich Merz becoming the new German chancellor this week and going to Paris and Warsaw. We'll have more on that on a future podcast. But now I think we'll transition to our conversation with Abe Newman and the current fight over transatlantic technology issues.
We are thrilled to welcome Abe Newman to the Eurofile. Abe is professor in the School of Foreign Service and Government Departments at Georgetown University and serves as the director of the BMW Center for German and European Studies. With Henry Farrell, he's the co-author of Underground Empire: How America Weaponized the World Economy, which tells the story of how the United States has dominated globe-spanning networks such as fiber optic cables and obscure payment systems. More recently, he co-authored a foreign affairs article with Farrell titled The Brewing Transatlantic Tech War: How Silicon Valley Got Entangled in Geopolitics and Lost. Abe, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with the current landscape. We know these days U.S. tech companies have gotten closer to President Trump and his entourage, and certainly with his administration. How big is the risk in your mind for these companies when it comes to the relationship with Europe as Europe moves further into the regulatory space?
Great. Well, I mean, I think one of the core arguments that Henry and I want to get across is that there really is a new type of political risk out there in the world, and firms, unfortunately, I don't think have fully caught up to that new landscape. And so traditionally, when you thought about political risk, the main question was, if you made investments in a foreign country, would those be at risk because of weak property rights or rule of law in that destination of investment? So it was kind of the traditional, like, would my property or my investments get nationalized and I would lose that? But really, the new world of political risk is how the channels of globalization, whether that's communication, investment, production, those systems create political risks at home by the home country that you are based in. And I think what we're seeing right now for Silicon Valley is that they're playing a game where politics is local, but markets are global. And so the decisions that they make at home to, let's say, invest in the inauguration of the Trump administration or to work alongside the Trump administration in terms of X or Starlink, that those now have political risks on how those firms could be perceived, their reputations globally, and particularly in Europe, which in many cases is the second biggest or biggest market for these companies. And so in the piece, Henry and I kind of lay out how Silicon Valley has, in a very quick time span, made a pivot towards cozying up to the US government in a way that could threaten their independence or their view of being independent in these global markets.
It seems to me that this has become a huge priority for the Trump administration, the European tech regulation, and that Silicon Valley kind of sees it that American administrations weren't really defending their interests previously. The Trump administration, the first time, viewed them all as maybe progressive and liberal. The Biden administration thought they should all be regulated, didn't really stand up for them. That now They feel that there's an American president that's there to kind of push back on this unfair regulation from the Europeans. When there was recently a Digital Markets Act fine from the European Commission targeted Facebook. And it was interesting. Joel Kaplan, a senior executive there, described it as a tariff, very sort of strong language, attacking the European Union. How do you think this is going to play out? Because it seems like what the tech companies in Silicon Valley is doing is escalating this conflict so that it's taking it from what is kind of a more technocratic place, moving it to the White House and having the White House put a ton of emphasis and leverage that it has to try to get the Europeans to back down. How do you think this is going to play out? Do you think the Europeans are going to sort of soft pedal certain things? Do you think they're going to back down? How do you sort of see this playing out? And if the way I characterized it isn't how you would characterize it, please recharacterize it.
Well, I think it's important just to think about how digital politics and digital markets have really changed, and how both in Europe, there's been a transformation, in the United States and within the sector itself. And so let me just quickly describe, if you go back, this industry, which we think of as this behemoth, is very young. Google has not existed for that long, Facebook even less. And so these companies are relatively new. And when Europe and the United States started to regulate or create or think about these sectors, platform, social, all mobile, they thought they were both going to share this market. So if you go back to 2000, when the United States is kind of creating the rule book around these markets, they're both creating a world of where there's going to be competition, where some European firms are going to win, some American firms are going to win. And they kind of they copy each other in terms of the rule book. You get the kind of the no liability rules in the United States. They're copied in Europe. Same thing about kind of the market dynamics. Anyway, you flash forward just a few years, Deutsche Telekom is not winning in these markets. The kind of legacy providers of Europe also ran companies. Nokia, it was poised to be the biggest player in mobile. It falls off a cliff. And so the current kind of the escalation of market regulation within Europe, in my mind, it's a natural consequence of they have a market where they're not providing the goods, and they have to then just watch out for their consumers with basically foreign companies providing critical infrastructure. And so in a world where you have kind of equal playing field, you would have domestic firms lobbying for less rules, right? You would have domestic firms saying, no, we don't want as stringent privacy regulations. We don't want as stringent content moderation. But there really aren't domestic champions in this mix. And politically, it's very difficult for European actors to say, we really want to go soft on foreign companies in these critical sectors. So that dynamic has led to, I think, stricter rules that then put more pressure on the United States companies because they're the only real providers. At the same time, you have fragmentation within Silicon Valley on these questions. So just last week, Microsoft came out with a statement where it basically said it's going to provide sovereign technology to Europe. It's not going to be part of the kind of US government alliance. It understands that its market is global, and it would be threatened if it were perceived to be not neutral, if it was perceived to be too close to the US administration. But other players like Facebook or Meta, their strategy, as you said, is to basically cozy up to the US government to get them to crush Europe and these regulations. But I think, even Meta is seeing that strategy is quite fraught. They thought they were going to get the US government to back them against TikTok. And obviously that did not go as planned. And so you cannot count on this administration, or I think any US administration, to just be coterminous with a company's interests. It's all politics, and politics is messy. And so what I'm really worried about is as these firms make choices, particularly a company like X, it will face real challenges globally because it will be perceived as an arm of the US government.
Following the Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, when the United States then cut off intelligence sharing and deliveries of military equipment, that I think really jarred Europeans. They started to think about how the U.S. could leverage its Europeans' technology dependence, both on the military defense side. But I think that's starting to creep in also on the technology side and the infrastructure side. As you mentioned, there was all this talk of, does the United States have a kill switch on U.S. provided weapons and other things like that? Is there a sense in Europe that you're picking up on of Europeans looking to effectively de-risk from the United States? I'm sensing that on the military side, but I'm curious on the technology side of maybe not trying to rely on certain US providers for a lot of the digital infrastructure, the web services, other things like that. It strikes me as very difficult that we are the game in town. But do you think there's a danger of decoupling, that the Europeans say, okay, this may be disruptive, cost more, but we're going to start spending and start acting as though we can't really rely on the United States and taking measures to de-risk in the way that they were thinking about vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is really the transformation in my mind that's been happening in Europe in the last 3 months, is that for the last several years, the primary focus of European regulation was on what I would call level playing field. It was an effort to increase competition in these sectors to allow for different companies to mitigate monopolistic control by US providers. And so the focus was really economic. But what I think Ukraine interaction and Starlink in particular, it demonstrated what something that Henry Farrell and I have discussed in our book, Underground Empire, is how these hubs, these economic hubs in the global economy, they can be weaponized in a way where they create points of coercion, where basically states like the United States can then condition access to these central positions in the global economy. So if everybody relies on Starlink for their domestic militaries, and then all of a sudden the United States is saying, well, we can throttle your access to it, that becomes quite dangerous for these countries. And so what you see is now a conversation that's not just about competitiveness. It's not just about level playing field. It is about strategic dependence on these. And do they need to take action to protect themselves about these kind of core foreign policy goals? And I think you see the first tremors of that. So on the one hand, there's been a conversation in Europe about what they're calling Eurostack, which is like, could they create a alternative internal European technology core from cloud to the platforms that would be European? But also even on the Starlink debate, if you think about Italy and what's been happening in Italy, the Meloni government is quite close to X and the providers, and Meloni herself has met with Musk multiple times. But you see the opposition party using it as kind of a wedge to signal that, Meloni's weak on national security issues. And so in my mind, it's all politics in the end. Nothing is like on, off, yes, no, but it is like now become politicized in a way that it wasn't a year ago. And so I think the dilemma for Europeans is that there's no short-term fix for most of these technologies. You cannot replace Starlink overnight with a European provider, but it is more a question of how does this change politics in Europe? And then in the long term, do they find a path to address it?
I think what's challenging in Europe, so yes, there are definitely geopolitical dynamics to this more recently. And as you said earlier, for the last few years, it was very much focused on level playing field, et cetera. I think what's difficult is in the political space, there's public demand for regulation of this. I mean, on the US side, we hear a lot, Europeans are killing competitiveness in the tech space. They're over-regulating the industry, which to me is always kind of a question, like, what is the proof that this is actually the issue? And the way you were phrasing it before, I was wondering, what is the chicken? What is the egg around Nokia, et cetera, kind of went down, and therefore there's no domestic industry to support lighter regulation. But European leaders are also dealing with a public that is demanding some sort of regulation the way I think Americans are not right now. Maybe I'm wrong about this. That I think that's another component in this equation that is tricky is Europeans do want regulations on surveillance. That's what we see in the AI Act, things like that. So European leaders have to reckon with that as well. And so they get stuck in that political challenge as well. Do you see any truth to that? Or is it really just focused on the economic incentives and trying to regain some market share through some of that regulation?
I do not buy the argument that US providers make that European regulation is hurting them. I mean, that's just laughable. Look at Google, Meta. Their market share in Europe it's almost like between 87 and 98%. So if European regulations are hurting them, please, look at their market cap. These companies are so wealthy, they are not hurting. They almost have unfettered market access to Europe. And so I just think that's a total red herring kind of argument. Of course, companies would like to have less regulation. It's like, but ultimately, is it hurting their bottom line? No. Are they facing undue pressure compared to domestic competitors? No. And so I think this is really more about politics again. It's about trying to avoid penalties, trying to avoid oversight. And that's their prerogative. I think it's important for Europeans to call them out on it. You very rarely hear Europeans saying, this is just politics and these companies aren't being hurt. Instead, it's a lot of like trying to justify the regulations. But I think that does not mean that Europe has failed in its digital transformation. And I think that that is true. And I think that that actually goes to a much deeper question, which I've asked a lot of people over time. I think it's a really fascinating research question. Why isn't Siemens playing a key role in digital life? Why are the kind of the core French industrial companies, why didn't they make this turn? And why did Nokia lose out in the mobile revolution? It's like, these are important questions. I think the Letta report and the Draghi report, they point to a lot of these things. I just don't think that the solution is gutting GDPR. It's like, if Europe has a different set of values when it comes to privacy, it has a different set of concerns about AI. I think you can easily have a world where you have those concerns and regulations, but you address these digital challenges. I lived in Berlin for a year. Nobody takes like mobile payment. It has nothing to do with GDPR. It's tax evasion. They don't want to pay the friggin' VAT. It's like, if you want to really talk about why Europe sucks in digital, it's very core things about people want to make their side hustle and their payments. So I think every side, both the Europeans and the Americans, could be more honest about what's going on in this dynamic. But I do not think Silicon Valley suffers because of European regulation. I think that's largely a red herring.
Is some of this also the fear of the Brussels effect by U.S. tech companies, that if they're successfully regulated by the Europeans, then suddenly Brazil has a model, Australia has a model, Japan, others, and that if Europe gets away with its regulatory approach, then others are just going to copy it around the world?
Once again, I think it's really important. It's all politics. And what you've seen is like within Silicon Valley, different actors play Europe off of each other. Apple, they like the Brussels effect because it squeezes Google, because Apple's main market is about equipment manufacturing and they're not so much about third-party information selling. Google, it's all about third-party information selling. And so you get this war where Tim Cook is like, I love European. I think we should have European privacy rules here. And then on the other side, you have Microsoft basically saying, we'll be a provider for any market. So I don't think we should think of it as there's a faction that the US is in charge of, and then Europe. It's often much more transnational, that you get these coalitions between like Apple and Europe that are putting pressure on Meta. What I think is different right now and what is so dangerous is this merging of the US state with these companies. And that's something that we haven't seen before. So if you could just go back a few years, Apple was refusing to give over data when there was a terrorist attack in San Bernardino and was saying, we're not going to crack this phone because we protect privacy. That's part of our business model. So now you have Twitter basically saying, we are going to be the arm of the US government's communications systems. If you're not going to hear from the FAA anymore, they're going to be on Twitter. And that is a model that I think if you're in Europe is quite shocking, because then you're like, oh, well, is this product just a market product or is it part of the US government? And that's what the article we're trying to lay out is like, that's distinctly different. It's new. And it should be, I think, concerning for these companies to be seen as not just market providers, but also potentially government actors.
What are the things that you're looking out for going ahead? What do you think could be sort of the areas of where there's going to be a big collision? You mentioned in the piece this obscure U.S. body, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the PCLOB, as being sort of one area where there could be a real collision over data flows. Maybe you could sort of describe what you think the kind of sources of tension that you see coming in the transatlantic tech space. What could explode?
I think one of the things that my perspective is, it's always about politics. The commission is going to try to be careful. Like, they're not going to want to try to disrupt this space because it provides a lot of money and consumer benefit to their consumers. And so one of these kinds of question mark spaces we describe in the piece is if the European Court of Justice gets involved, because the European Court of Justice has multiple times proven itself that it's willing to blow up these data agreements between the US and Europe. And there are a set of NGOs, Max Schrems, who runs this organization, None of Your Business. He is always looking for a way to basically, needle Silicon Valley and particularly Meta and Google. And so there's, I think, a high likelihood that he brings another case that he says, we're getting this merging of the US government and the data providers. And in the last set of agreements, one of the ideas was there would be an independent US organization that could then provide redress to European citizens. And I think you could make the case that that is no longer functioning in a credible way. And so that the European Court of Justice would once again blow it up. And it would be, I think, each time the Commission has to think about the politics of signing on to a new deal with the US administration. And I think the politics of signing on to a new deal with this administration could be quite challenging for the Commission. And therefore, it could really disrupt these data flows. I think another question mark is, we already mentioned is there a new kind of backlash in Europe to US tech, not just about economic issues, but about security issues, and which US companies will be exposed. And we've already seen Starlink is clearly in the crosshairs of this conversation, and Microsoft is trying to differentiate itself from Starlink and saying, we are going to be a neutral provider. And so I think we'll see, do we get new contracts? Are Europeans willing to use, let's say, less efficient technology because they're worried about this risk? I always try to tell people, you don't need Twitter or Facebook or, we all survived for hundreds of years without these things. They're not that old. And most of what they do is they allow us to be entertained while we go to the bathroom. It's honestly, is it so terrible if Europe has more restrictions on some of these technologies?
We also lived through a pandemic where everything got disrupted. So a little bit of slowdown or disruption, I think there's somewhat of a tolerance.
Well, there certainly is in Europe. There's a mindset in Europe that's more open to a slight reduction in convenience for these other incentives around security, around privacy, that there isn't necessarily as much in the US, in my view.
I mean, I think that the issue that Europe has is really about, it is so committed to the idea of openness and about market access and about the free rules-based system that it has been reluctant to put up barriers to US companies, because there's that trope that the EU is a neoliberal Trojan horse. It's for me, it's more of just it's self-confined often by the idea that its mission is to open markets. It's to keep this single market working. And so it has to get beyond that to really think of security as a reason why it would limit some of these activities. And you see the Commission has rapidly, it had this economic security agenda, the geopolitical commission. It is grappling with these sets of ideas, but it is still kind of against its DNA to do these things. And so I think that's really where the rubber will hit the road is it willing to accept inefficiency for security over the priority of just market openness?
That's a fantastic point, a great way to end the conversation. Abe Newman, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been great to have you on the Eurofile.
Thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks, Abe.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.